Now to the confusion at the border over the Trump administration's Remain in Mexico policy. On Friday, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals temporarily blocked the controversial Migrant Protection Protocols program. That was a lot of alliterations there, finding it was likely illegal.
But later that day, the same court granted an emergency request filed by the Trump administration to reinstate the program while further arguments are heard.
To explain what this all means, here's CBS News immigration reporter Camilo Montoya-Galvez. Good to see you.
Good to see you guys, too.
All right, so Camilo, the initial ruling created tension and confusion at the border. So what happened the first few hours after the court temporarily blocked the program?
Yeah, so the Ninth Circuit initially on Friday blocked the so-called Remain in Mexico program, finding that it is likely illegal. But hours later in the night, the same court paused its own order granting an emergency request by Trump administration lawyers who rushed to defend the policy and argued in court that there could be a surge at the southern border if the initial order remained in place. And after that, in the intervening hours in between those two orders, there were lawyers and asylum seekers who showed up at ports of entries along the U.S.-Mexico border to try and see if they could get some type of relief through this order. But this was obviously a short-lived victory for these asylum seekers and advocates, and it remains to be seen whether the Ninth Circuit will continue to set aside its initial order and if the administration will appeal the initial order to the Supreme Court, which in recent weeks has shown a tendency to allow the administration to implement these controversial immigration policies.
So, Camilo, why did the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals initially rule against the Remain in Mexico program?
Yes, so two circuit judges on a three-judge panel said that the policy was likely illegal because plaintiffs had shown that they were likely to succeed on two challenges to the program. First, that the policy violated a principle in international and domestic law that says you cannot return asylum seekers and refugees to places where they may face persecution. The other reason was that the court found that the program also was not legal because the 1996 immigration law that the administration has been citing to defend the legality of the policy does not allow the U.S. to categorically send asylum seekers to a neighboring country like Mexico. And so it remains to be seen, like I said, whether the administration will appeal this ruling to the Supreme Court.
So, Camilo, immigration advocates say it's inhumane and a violation of international rights for migrants. So what kind of risks do asylum seekers face when they're sent to Mexico to wait out cases? You've reported on this quite a bit.
Yeah, and the court acknowledged this, citing reporting by CBS News and other news outlets that asylum seekers sent to Mexico under this program face substantial harm and even death. That's an actual quote from the ruling. As we reported, right, some of these asylum seekers are sent to areas in Mexico that the State Department warns U.S. citizens not to visit because of rampant violence there. The threat of kidnapping, extortions, and even killings in some of these regions that have the same State Department designation as war zones like Syria. So, there have been a lot of concerns for the safety of these asylum seekers. And the other main point of concern for advocates is the due process that they believe these asylum seekers are not getting because most of them are not able to find lawyers in Mexico that can help them argue their cases in front of a judge.
All right, so then with this program temporarily reinstated, what happens next? What happens next with the case? What happens to the people who are waiting at the border?
Right, so the program was reinstated, as you mentioned, and officials now have the ability again to return migrants who express fear of returning to their home countries to Mexico. They can send back people from all countries in Latin America, including Brazil, except for Mexicans, because you cannot return people to the country they are fleeing to under U.S. law and international law. But it's also important to underscore, Anne-Marie and Vlad, that the administration has been shifting away from this policy to deter asylum seekers. It is now turning to rapid deportation programs, as well as bilateral agreements it brokered with the countries in Central America's northern triangles to basically get asylum seekers off U.S. soil as quickly as possible. So they definitely have other options if the Remain in Mexico policy is blocked again.
So they would send them to Guatemala, for example.
Right, correct. Or Honduras or El Salvador.
Let me ask you finally about the Trump administration's response to a federal judge's ruling on Sunday that Ken Cuccinelli was unlawfully appointed to a top immigration post within the administration. I note that the judge also referenced The Office, which is, right, Camilo, which I thought was really funny.
Yeah, we had a lot of news on the immigration front over the weekend. The judge in the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C., here in Washington, D.C., said that Ken Cuccinelli had been unlawfully appointed as acting head of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, the agency within the Department of Homeland Security that administers benefits for non-citizens like refugees, asylum seekers, and green card holders looking to gain U.S. citizenship. The judge found that the administration violated federal vacancies law when appointing Cuccinelli to this top immigration post. But it remains to be seen how this will technically and concretely affect his role at the Department of Homeland Security, because he is both the acting USCIS director and he's also the #2 official at the Department of Homeland Security. He's the acting deputy director in the department. And what's also important to note is that the judge said that because he had been unlawfully appointed to this role at USCIS, some of his orders were invalid, including an order which reduced the amount of time asylum seekers have to prepare for their interviews with asylum seekers, with asylum officers, rather.
Right. All right, that's pretty interesting stuff. Double acting.
Yes.
We've talked a lot about, these individuals that remain in sort of acting positions because they do not have to then be vetted by Congress as they had been vetted before for another job.
Exactly right.
You know?
Exactly.
Every top official at the Department of Homeland Security is serving on an acting basis.
Wow.
The Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection is acting in an acting capacity. So is the director of ICE, and so is the Secretary of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf. He's an acting secretary.
Right. So Judge Moss in the riff on The Office said there may be a difference between one who serves as the assistant regional manager and the assistant to the regional manager, but essentially you're still the #2.
Right. Yeah. I mean, sadly, in this case, The Office is a great show, but we're talking about people's lives.
That's
here.
That's exactly right.
It's
exactly right.
It's crazy. Camilo, thank you so much.